Thank you, DSG, President. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here to share with you some thoughts on this very critical subject of costs of capital and the bearing and relationship with credit rating agencies. I want to offer you today a systemic perspective on the challenge we're facing, to give you a framework for thinking about this problem. I think where there are system failures, and I think what we are witnessing today is a system failure, sometimes problems are actually symptoms of something we need to address, and solving the problem itself will not do that. And in thinking about a systemic approach, I want to, as an entry point, talk to you about two traditions in economic policy that I've come across in my 30 years. The first one is that implicitly, explicitly, is a belief that markets will function, can provide solutions to our myriad of challenges, and that when they don't, it's because of a lack of information. It's a lack of transparency. It's a lack of certainty. I call this the information deficiency school. And there are those within that school who will also argue that markets sometimes need nudging, sometimes need better incentives to align themselves with the social objectives we wish to see, whether that's through taxes and subsidies. But by and large, there's the information deficiency school who says that if we see a problem, it's partly because of a lack of transparency, a lack of information. We're seeing that in the focus on the GEMS database that we in the multilateral development banks are producing in the hope that showing that in fact the microcredit risks of investments is small will change the investment profile. We see that in some of the approaches to the cost of capital problem. That if only there was more information, people would see this as perceived risks rather than real risks, and the cost of capital will fall. And we see that in our thinking about credit rating agencies, that if only that they had better information, they used the information better, which I think is perhaps even more important, then that will also help to reduce the blockages and obstacles to the flow, the critical flow of capital to development and developing countries. But I think that the information school gets one thing right, but also misses something big. And the other tradition in economic policy is the institutional school, that the world we face has institutional constraints. That these pools of capital we talk about, the billions to trillions, are driven by institutional investors. And they are subject to external regulation, internal regulation. They use credit ratings when they could use other things, but that's the institutional approach. And that is why credit ratings have this disproportionate impact on the flow of capital. But this institutional approach also helps to explain why only 2% of institutional investors' money is invested in developing countries. Only 2%. A fundamental problem. Only 2% of the world's savings, international savings, are going to where 60% of the growth is. This is not just a development problem, it's an economic investment problem. But here's another institutional thing, and maybe I'll get to it by this observation. If you look at credit ratings and compare them to domestic economic fundamentals, you see a significant bias. Most developing countries have lower debt to GDP ratios than most of our European friend countries. Most developing countries have lower deficit to GDP ratios than many developed countries. And so you see a stark bias between ratings and domestic fundamentals. But if you compare ratings and outcomes, that bias is largely diminished. What that is saying to us is that what is driving the credit challenges of developing countries is not their domestic fundamentals, or at least not alone, or not even chiefly. It is an international financial system that the credit ratings are capturing. As we know, the world is divided between those countries that have reserve currencies and those countries that do not. Those with reserve currencies export safety. They have safety. When they're in crisis, they can act in a quick way to deal with the crisis. They can lower interest rates. They can expand their fiscal policy, spend more, deal with the crisis, mop it up, absorb it. Most developing countries, all developing countries, are importers of safety. They do not have reserve currencies. When they're in a crisis, they have to act contra-cyclically. They have to raise interest rates to defend their currency. They have to cut back on spending and social programs to defend their currency and their fiscal position. They make the crisis worse. They're forced to make the crisis worse. And that is what the credit ratings are showing. They are a symptom of a broken system. They're a symptom of the fact that although many African countries have lower debt to GDP ratios than, say, our friends in Italy or in Greece, when Italy or Greece gets into trouble, the ECB might buy their bonds. When Botswana and Kenya get into trouble, perhaps caused externally by the largest economy in the world raising interest rates, not internally. When they get into trouble, there's no one to buy their bonds. And it's that the credit ratings are picking up in a substantial way. So let that not distract from the fact that credit ratings play a disproportionate impact on the flow of capital. We must make sure that these ratings are as accurate as possible, that they use up-to-date information. In my own experience, coming from a developing country, they don't always put the sharpest person on your country's issues. If your country is not generating the kind of income flow that because they're a commercial organization. And so you have people of different abilities, different expertise having a disproportionate impact. But whilst these ratings are not always accurate, whilst they're not always efficient, by and large they're reflecting an international system that is very much biased against developing countries. And we need to change that system. We need to change that system with better safety nets, an automatic SDR release when countries get into natural disasters. We need pause clauses in all of our debt. We need to change the debt architecture so that it is absorbing of crashes, and that will change the international system and get us better credit ratings because we've leveled up the system. So we need to do two things. Yes, we need to improve the accuracy of these ratings, but we also need to observe the signal they're sending, the symptom of a bigger problem, of the unfairness and iniquity of the international financial system. And we can do something about that. We can create better safety nets. We can create better absorbing ability in our bond instruments. And let's do that. Thank you very much indeed.